Hi everyone, Janie here. Welcome back to my garden. I am pretty excited about today's video because today's video is a bit of a collaboration with Proven Winners, specifically Proven Winners' monthly newsletter called The Winner's Circle. The Winner's Circle is filled with such fantastic in-depth information that's timely. They send it out once per month, so it's kind of reminders for all of us gardeners of what we should be thinking about and what we should be doing in our gardens that month. Now, I know we're kind of going into the downtime of our gardening season, at least for those of us here in the Northern Hemisphere. We are in fall, we're going into winter, things are starting to quiet down, things are starting to go to sleep for the season, but it's the perfect time to take this opportunity to focus on the foundation of our garden, the building blocks of our garden. So come spring, when it's time to start planting again, those plants are ready to take off and thrive because we've really thought of building a successful foundation in our gardens. So the Proven Winners Winner's Circle newsletter over the next 5 months, starting in November and ending in March, is going to be focusing on just that. It's going to be focusing on the foundations of our gardens for building a successful garden. There are 5 topics, one for each month, and I am going to be making a video on each of those topics just to kind of go over some things that we all should be thinking about for the foundations of our garden. The topics are for November, we're starting with soil, which is the foundation, the definition of the foundation of our gardens. For December, we're going to focus on water, which is a big issue for me here in Zone 9B, where we don't get a lot of water. So it is definitely something that we need to think about over here in California and other arid areas in the country. For January, we're focusing on light and light requirements of plants and what you should be thinking about for light requirements for your plants. For February, we're thinking about site issues, things that maybe you don't really think about. Maybe you're having an issue with your plants or you don't know why, and it might be because you have a site issue of where your particular garden or garden bed is situated. And then finally, we're going to cap it off in March with plant selection, which is the most fun topic and the one that we're all excited about. But let's think about all the stuff that come before plant selection. So let's get started with November's topic, which is soil. Soil, the ultimate building block of our gardens. Soil is step one. We all need to start with soil. So today's video is going to be focused on 5 tips for maintaining healthy soil in your garden. So let's get started. So tip number 1 that I have for all of you for improving the health of your soil or maintaining the health of your soil is knowing what type of soil you're actually dealing with. You have to know what you're dealing with before you can know what you need to do with it. So to understand what type of soil you have to understand how we describe soil. And the way we describe soil is mainly the size of the minerals that are in soil. And there's 3 main ones. There are sand particles, which are pretty big. Think of sand particles as like the size of a beach ball. Okay, just go with me here. Then second, we have silt particles, and think of silt particles more like the size of a frisbee. So they are smaller, and so that means that they're going to act differently than that beach ball does. The third type of particle is called clay. Clay particles or clay soil. You've probably heard this. Think of clay particles in your soil as the size of a dime, right? A tiny little dime, not even a quarter, a dime, right? So we have a dime over here in clay particles, and we have a big beach ball over here in sand particles, and that soil is going to act differently. The structure is different. So it's really important to figure out what type of soil you have. It's usually a mixture of all 3. And where we get into trouble is when there is a huge percentage of one type of those particles. So say for instance, you have a huge percentage of clay particles in your soil. So think about you have a whole bunch of dimes in your soil. That is going to act differently than a soil that has a huge percentage of sand particles. When you have an equal percentage of all 3, equal percentage of clay, silt, and sand, that's what we call loamy soil or loam, and that is key. If you have loamy soil, you are lucky. Count your blessings, be happy. The rest of us that don't have loamy soil sometimes have to do things to help our soil out to get it closer to that loamy state. Now, how do you know what type of soil you have? There's a couple different ways. The easiest is ask your neighbor. Your neighbor maybe is a gardener and maybe knows what type of soil you have. A second way that you can do it is you can actually go out into your garden, grab a bunch of soil and get it a little bit wet. This is called the pinch test, the ribbon test, sometimes it's called the ball test. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to get the soil wet in your hands. And you can kind of rub it like that. If it feels really gritty, your soil probably has a lot of sand in it. If it feels really slimy, it probably has a lot of silt in it. And if it feels really cold and kind of like Play-Doh, it probably has a lot of clay in it. The other way you can do is the ribbon test, which is where you actually pinch that soil, that wet soil, into a ribbon. And if you can allow that ribbon to come out a certain distance, the further the distance that pinched ribbon of soil can come out, the more clay content you have in that soil. So you can look up the ribbon test or the pinch test or the ball test for your soil online. That's another really easy way to kind of figure out what you're dealing with. The third way is kind of getting experts' advice. You can get a soil test and that can tell you what type of soil you're dealing with. If you live in the United States, this is just a sidebar, there is an app out there called Soil Web, and Soil Web is fantastic. It's been put together by a whole bunch of soil scientists, and they've actually mapped out the entire United States down to your property. So when I lived on 0.17 of an acre in town in Davis, I knew what type of soil I had compared to my neighbor 3 doors down. So if you download the Soil Web app, it's free. You can look it up yourself, and that can tell you what type of soil you have. Within reason, because of course things might have changed, but it's its best guess. Tip number 2 that I have for all of you for maintaining or improving the health of your soil is understanding the importance of organic matter in your soil and actually working on improving the amount of organic matter that you have in your soil. Now, why, right? So soil is made up of 3 different things, basically 3 different phases, right? We have our solids, we have our liquids, and we have our air. Air, of course, in soil is the air that's in between the soil particles. When you dig a hole in your garden, you are not hitting anything solid, or we wouldn't be able to get our trowel in there, right? There's air pockets that are in between the particles in the soil, and that's actually really important for soil. For water, there's a certain level of moisture content in the soil, and that's really, really important. Obviously, these plants need water to live. Even the bugs and the the microbes, they need water to live in your soil. So water is really important. But then when we're talking about the solids in soil, the solids are comprised of 2 things, and that is minerals and organic matter. And the minerals I already talked about, that's the sand, the clay, the silt, right? But those actually don't have any nutritional value. They give some structure, of course, but it's more like they're just fillers. It's the organic matter that actually gives life to the soil. So organic matter, it helps with the structure of the soil. It gives soil more of those air pockets. It gives soil more of an opportunity to hold on to water for those plants. But it also does some chemical reactions in your soil where it actually helps with some cation exchange. That's just kind of a fancy way of saying it helps with the balance of chemicals in your soil, and it allows plants to take up nutrients more easily. It allows the bugs to function like they need to, and it just allows everything to kind of work together. And organic matter does that. Like I said, I live on the West Coast, I live in California, and California soil is notorious for having a huge lack of organic matter. They say that you want at least 5% of organic matter in your soil, and California on average has about 1%, which is not great. So what the recommendations, at least for us over in California, but for a lot of people across the country, is that you can never add too much organic matter to your soil. The more compost you add and the more living organisms that you add, the better your soil is going to be. So it's something that you need to think about. It's something that's definitely necessary. And the more you focus on the amount of organic matter in your soil, the more your soil is going to act like that perfect, balanced, living thing, right? Actually, you want to think about soil as a living thing. It's alive, and you need to feed it with organic matter. You don't want it just to sit there as little clay particles or little sandy particles. So how do you actually add organic matter to your soil? There's a couple ways to do it. Organic mulches are huge, right? That's why a lot of people will say leave the leaves, because leaves are organic. And when you leave them in your soil this time of year, they will start to break down, and that is carbon that's breaking down. That is an organic living thing that's breaking down, and it's actually feeding your soil. So leaving the leaves is one way to do it. Actually adding compost, you can get compost and add it to your soil. That's going to help it as well. And then you can do other things like the chop and drop method, which is where you prune things back and then you kind of just leave it there and wait for it to get absorbed into the soil, to break down and absorb into your soil. So there's a lot of different ways that you can add the amount of organic matter into your soil. You just have to figure out which way works for you in your garden. But it's something to understand the importance of organic matter and the importance of increasing the amount of organic matter that you have in your garden. Tip number 3 I have for all of you for maintaining and improving your soil health is mulch, mulch, mulch. And I say mulch, mulch, mulch because when I was in my Master Gardener's training, that is how they actually referred to mulch. It wasn't worth it to call mulch just mulch by name. We had to say mulch, mulch, mulch. That is how important it was to us, right? And that is what a difference it can make in our garden and for our soil health. Now, I do live in California. I live in a very dry climate where we get a lot of extreme temperatures and we don't get a lot of water. So mulch is going to be more important for someone like me that lives over here than somebody that gets more temperate temperatures, more mild temperatures, and does get some rain. But it's still something to think about for your soil health. So the important things, at least for me I live in a very hot climate, and those of you who live in a very cold climate, mulch actually levels out extreme temperatures. So when it is 110 degrees out here and my plants are suffering, mulch is actually going to protect that soil temperature and make sure that it doesn't get too hot. If the soil gets too hot, that can actually be detrimental not only for our plants, but actually for the living organisms in the soil. The bugs that are breaking down those leaves or breaking down that organic matter or creating those air pockets that the clay soil needs to breathe properly. So keeping that temperature controlled is really important. It's the same thing, it goes the other way as well. When you have a really cold environment, mulch is going to protect that soil from getting too cold, and then it's going to protect your roots and it's going to protect the organisms that are in the soil. Here in California, we deal with drought basically on a yearly basis. So mulch is extra important for us to maintain the moisture levels and the moisture availability for plants. When you put a big, nice, thick layer of mulch on our soil, the evaporation rate is going to decrease and we're not going to have to continually battle the heat and continually be watering our plants and watering our soil to make sure that there is a moisture content level there for our plants. So it's super, super important in areas of drought. Then a couple other important things with mulch that you don't want to forget about. Mulch prevents erosion. So if you garden on a hill, having a nice layer of mulch is going to prevent all that beautiful soil running away from your plants. It's going to keep it where it needs to be. It's also going to suppress weeds. So you don't want your plants to be dealing with competition against weeds. Weeds are going to try and take all those beautiful nutrients from your plants, and mulch is going to suppress those weeds so that your plants can thrive and take all of the nutrition that it needs. Finally, mulch looks nice. I like how mulch looks. I think it's beautiful. I think it is like the icing on the cake in the garden. So it is a benefit for our soil to use mulch. It is wonderful, but it also makes the garden look so pretty. So that is why I say, and all of the Master Gardener trainers that I had, that is why we don't say mulch. We say mulch, mulch, mulch. Tip number 4 for improving or maintaining your soil health, I've kind of touched on a little bit, and that is thinking about the amount amount of air you have in your soil and the amount of water you have in your soil. We talked about the solids with the organic matter, but now we're actually going to think about the air and the water and why they are important to our soil health. So air and water, the amount of air and water you have in your soil, that kind of makes up what's called the bulk density or the structure of your soil. And that's something important to think about because you think about those minerals in your soil, the particles of sand, the particles of clay, the particles of silt, and that is going to change your soil structure. So if you have very clay soil that has very small particles, again, think about those little dimes, they're all packed together, there's not a lot of air in there. That also means there is not a lot of space for water to get through that really compacted soil. So when you water soil that is compacted like this and doesn't have a lot of air pockets, that water might just sit there and it might not move at all. So if you have really clay soil with not a lot of air, it's going to affect your watering and it's going to affect the health of your soil. The exact opposite occurs when you have really sandy soil and you have really, really big beach balls that don't closely line up with each other. You're going to have really big pores in that soil. You're going to have big spaces and lots of area for that water to kind of just quickly flow through your soil. And so you kind of have to think, if you have sandy soil, you're thinking about the air and the water amount that you have in there. You have a lot of air and you have nothing that's actually going to hold the water there. The water is going to run right through it. And when it runs right through it, it's going to take that organic matter with it. So that's something to think about as well. So the amount of air that you have in your soil and the amount of water that you have in your soil is super, super important. The amount of water that you have in your soil is referred to as your water holding capacity. And that, again, it's different depending on what type of soil particles you have, how much organic matter you have, the structure of your soil. All of those things kind of make it up. And that's why I'm going to take this back. That's why it's so important to have organic matter in your soil, because organic matter is going to help the structure and it's going to help maintain the moisture level in your soil to kind of normalize everything. So if you have super sandy soil, you add some compost to it, it's going to improve the amount of air and improve the amount of water that you have in your soil. One thing I will say, this is another thing that I learned from my Master Gardener's class. We asked the horticulturist that was teaching us this, what is the one tip that you can give us that we need to never forget? And what she said to us is, do not dig, do not walk, do not do anything in your garden when it's raining. And this is super, super important because when it's raining and when you have all that extra moisture in your soil, and if you step on it or if you dig in it, what you're doing is you're taking all of those particles and you're smashing them together. And that is called compacting your soil. And so you're basically taking whatever loamy soil you had or good soil you had, and you're making it into a thick layer of clay just because you've put that mechanical pressure on. So if you understand one thing from this tip, my Master Gardener trainers would be very upset if I didn't say, do not dig when it's raining. Try not to walk over your garden soil when it's raining. Do your best to try and leave the soil alone when it's raining so that your soil can maintain those pore spaces and maintain the amount of air and the amount of water it has in it. All right, everyone, tip number 5 that I have for improving or maintaining the health of your soil is to think about the living things that are in your soil. Think about the microbes that are living down there in your soil. It's a whole nother world down there, and it's up to us as gardeners to take care of them and make sure that they're down there and they're thriving and they're happy. So there's a couple things that we can do to make them unhappy, and there's a couple things that we can do to make them very happy. And of course, we want to keep them happy because they help us in the garden. They help transfer those nutrients to our plants. They help feed our plants. They help break down organic matter. They do the things that we want them to do. So I've kind of already touched on a couple things that kind of pertain to the same tip. Again, you don't want extreme temperatures in your soil. So mulch, 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 right? And organic matter. If the soil gets too hot, or if the soil gets too cold, extreme temperatures, they're actually going to kill the microbes that are in your soil, and you're basically going to have to start all over. So it's something to think about, keeping the temperature nice and even, and to do that, kind of just put a blanket on your garden. The microbes will be really happy, and that way they can stay alive and thrive in your garden soil. The other thing you want to think about is maintaining the moisture level in your soil. I recently moved into this property a couple months ago, and this soil has not been touched for years. I had the cracking. It looked like a desert out there. There is zero moisture content in this soil, and that is not good for the microbes in my soil. I know that. It was important for me to get at least some moisture into the soil so the living organisms can kind of start doing their thing down there. You want to make sure that there is a certain level of moisture content. Mulch is going to help that because it's going to prevent evaporation. If you get natural rainfall, that's great, but amending your soil with some organic matter is going to help that as well, because it's going to maintain that structure. It's going to improve the water holding capacity of your soil. It's going to prevent the evaporation of your soil, and it's going to keep those microbes happy. So something else that you can do to make those microbes happy down underneath the ground is you can actually feed them with fertilizers and such. Organic matter is of course going to help this because it's going to give them everything that they want, but there's also some really great fertilizers that you can get at the store these days, and it can actually help with the soil health, and actually has these great additives like mycorrhizae that's actually going to help those living beings and make the connections to the plant roots. It gets very chemistry, right? But if you start looking into it, it really makes a huge difference for your soil. So it's something to think about that's going to help the microbes in your soil. Now, for a couple things that you can do to make them mad is kind of the opposite of what I just said. Not watering them, not mulching them so that they get really, really hot and they basically burn up. And then also spraying them down with chemicals, right? We all have pests in our garden. We all have fungus in our garden and all that kind of stuff. And yes, we need to take care of it, but you have to think about the soil health and all the other living things that are going on in your garden that you don't want to harm while you're trying to harm something else. Please look up the IPM method. This is the integrated pest management method. This is a method of pest management that's going to have the least effect on everything else while still attacking whatever is bothering you, whatever pest, whatever fungus, whatever bug, right? But when we come out into our gardens and we use the systemic approach and we, basically spray everything down with a chemical, not only does it kill the bad stuff, but it also kills the good stuff in our soil. So just kind of think of that, really educate yourself before you spray something like that in your garden, because you actually might be doing more damage. I can say this because I have done it to my garden before and I have dealt with the consequences. So just kind of think about that. It's something really important for keeping our soil healthy. So that is it for my 5 tips for maintaining or improving the health of your soil. Again, if you all haven't signed up for the Proven Winners Winner Circle newsletter, make sure you do, because every month for the next 5 months, they're going to be focusing on a different topic that is going to help us build a better foundation for a successful garden, which I just think is so cool, because that means during this downtime where everything kind of calms down a little bit, we have time to really think about the foundation, literal foundation of our gardens. We can focus on everything that we need to focus on so that come spring, when it's time to start planting all these beautiful plants, these plants are going to take off and they're going to thrive because we took the time to think about everything else. So make sure you sign up for that Proven Winners newsletter. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, because I am going to be putting these videos in a playlist down below as well. I will call it the Building the Foundation of a Successful Garden with Proven Winners playlist. So stay tuned for next month, December, which is where we talk about something that is very, very important to me out here in California, and that is water. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you all have a chance to get in your garden today.